Hello. Today for COM 118 Introduction to Media Effects, we're going to talk a little bit about social science and more broadly the ideas that inform the ways that we figure out what a media effect really is. So let's talk about effects. How do we determine an effect? Well, simply put, we do research. And what is research? How do we think about doing research for media effects? Well, we follow scientific principles, and the shortest and fastest way to define science is it's the process of systematic observation. You can listen, you can watch, you can record, you can take notes. And really this harkens back to the days in grade school and junior high and high school when you learned about the scientific method. We're going to use the exact same method when we're studying media and the ways in which it affects people and it affects society. We're going to do some observations, see what's going on. How do people use media generally? And that's going to spark a question. And in trying to answer that question, we might form a hypothesis, which is just a prediction. And then we're going to test that prediction. And we're going to talk about ways and tools we can use to test those predictions. We look at the results, and then if the results support our hypothesis, great. We're going to keep retesting it, though. We're going to make sure that in multiple instances, we get that same result. And if we get the same result over and over again, we can have a theory that guides future research that helps us make predictions about the ways in which future use of media might affect users. But more commonly, our hypotheses are not supported. That's kind of the standard in science. You do some observations, make a guess about what might happen, but it doesn't always pan out. That's why we collect the data. And so then we have to revise our hypothesis and test again until we more reliably get those results that match our hypotheses. So it's this iterative process. That's why we have those loops, those cycles. I love this comic from Nathan Pyle. Some of you may be familiar with his work. So there's a little alien who says, "I've attempted science," and the other adult alien says, "Please explain." The little guy says, "Well, I formed an idea, and I discovered I was wrong." The adult says, "There are numerous diagrams." The little guy says, "I was wrong in numerous ways. I produced a detailed tribute to my wrongness." Ah, that is science. And that is science. When I'm not teaching, I'm conducting social science research. I'm trying to study the media, and I will say that's very common. We make our best guess based on previous observations, but until we systematically collect that data in an unbiased way as possible and compare the results, it's hard to say one way or the other. So those of you who go on to do research yourselves, don't be frustrated when the hypothesis is wrong, because that's just part of science. It's a cyclical process where we build on our own work, we build on others' work to try to see where the data really point us. So let's talk about social science in particular. So in science, a lot of times we think of those beakers bubbling up with chemicals, but social science works just the same. The only difference is that we're systematically observing people and societies instead of chemicals in a beaker or cells under a microscope. Neil deGrasse Tyson had this tweet once where he said, "In science, when human behavior enters the equation, things go non-linear. That's why physics is easy and sociology is hard." And I couldn't agree more. We're using the same methods, but people are unpredictable. Even though we are people, it's hard to study ourselves. So we need to keep that in mind when we're thinking about social science and why we need to have a lot of research and a lot of data to try to understand the nuances of human behavior. I also love this quote from Albert Einstein. He said, "When we survey our lives and our endeavors, we soon observe that almost the whole of our actions and desires is bound up with the existence of other beings." And so here, we're really emphasizing the idea of social in social science, in that we are social creatures, humans are. Even when we're isolated in times of a pandemic, we're thinking about other people, we're consuming media that other people produced. We are social creatures, and that drives a lot of our behavior. So keeping in mind what other people think about media, how we've come to find the media we're watching, maybe it's because someone else recommended it or an algorithm built by other people recommended it for us, that there's an element of other people at all times shaping the ways in which we respond to media messages. So we're going to take a step back and think more broadly about science, because science is trying to, again, make systematic observations to gain knowledge. But what is knowledge? And epistemology is the area of research where we try to figure out how do we gain knowledge? What is knowledge? And it's a Greek word that means knowledge. Epistemology just means knowledge in Greek. And it's the idea of how we come to know something, or the philosophy of knowledge. Those of you taking philosophy classes might also talk about epistemology. And there's one particular type of epistemology that is most common in the media effects research we're going to talk about this semester. So I think it's important for us to delve into that and understand both its strengths and its weaknesses. And that is the idea of positivism. Positivists argue that to know something, to know the truth, is to measure it. So we can only know the things we can measure under a positivist philosophy. Again, observations equal truth for positivists. And generally, most positivists conduct experiments to try to find this objective truth. So one type of positivism that was really popular in the 1950s, 60s, 70s was that of behaviorism. And in particular, a researcher, a psychologist named B.F. Skinner, developed this idea of behaviorism. So I want us to watch this video. And again, Skinner was a psychologist, so keep that in mind. He was trying to predict human behavior. And we, as media effects researchers, are trying to think about behavior around media. So keep that in mind as we watch this video about B.F. Skinner and behaviorism.
I think today we have reached the point where not only can we dream about a better way of life, but we can make specific proposals. And that's where my own work comes in. I've been for 35 years concerned with behavior.
A Pennsylvanian psychologist, Skinner was the most radical practitioner of behaviorism. He believed that each person starts out as a blank slate and is molded purely by their environment. He began his work not with humans, but with pigeons. He trained them using a system called operant conditioning. He could get them to display the behavior he desired by conditioning them to respond to rewards.
They would peck on the little button, and if they pecked the right number of times, they would get a reward, i.e. some seed. And so they soon learnt that they must peck 6 times and very fast, and they'd get the seed. And then they would do that again and again. And he could train them to do all sorts of things. I mean, he trained pigeons to play ping pong.
No wonder then that Skinner thought he could also train humans of any age to behave better. In the early 70s, Skinner set up an experiment at a youth borstal, and the BBC followed his progress. Here, Skinner describes the inmates at the start of the project.
Few of them have had families they have lived with closely. Almost all have dropped out of school with little or no education. Few have ever held a job for any length of time, and all have violated the laws so often or so violently that it has been necessary to lock them up.
In the borstal, basic food and accommodation were provided. Skinner's masterstroke was to introduce a reward system. If the youngsters behaved well and attended lessons, they could earn points and improve their living conditions.
Your room was dirty a couple of days.
Dirty?
Then you went out of the cottage and properly dressed.
I would like to.
And see if you can do a little better next week. All
Yes,
right?
yes, sir. I really tried, sir.
Just try a little harder.
I think I'm so.
Points could be exchanged for more delicious food at meal times, admission to game rooms, the rental of a private room or television set, or even a short vacation away from the school. The results were dramatic. Boys who had been convinced by the school system that they were unteachable discovered that they were not. They learned reading, writing, and arithmetic and acquired manual skills. They did so without compulsion, and the hostile behavior characteristic of such institutions quickly disappeared.
Skinner's successes were seen as momentous achievements. And his work lives on in every child's star chart and employee reward scheme around the world. Skinner believed he had found a catch-all explanation for every facet of human behaviour. But when he turned his attention to language, he was to come very publicly unstuck.
What's back there?
What's that?
At this time, many scientists were asking where our remarkable ability for learning speech comes from.
That's a kangaroo.
Skinner's answer was relatively straightforward. He said, language is acquired by a system of operant conditioning. That is to say, children come into the world, they cannot speak, they have no language, and they acquire it by imitation from their parents, and that is reinforced by a system of rewards and punishments, the kind of rewards that operate in daily life, and which parents give them without even knowing that they do so. This idea, and it's a persuasive idea, was challenged.
Linguists of the day thought this was too simplistic and that more subtle forces were at work. In the early 70s, the BBC's Horizon programme decided to settle the debate.
First, the old lady will talk.
Skinner was asked to sit in on a language experiment designed to show that copying and rewards are not enough to make young children absorb complex grammar. Here, an older child is tested to see if she can copy what she has heard.
So the dragon goes first.
Lucy knows Linus, doesn't she?
She knows Linus, doesn't she?
But in another test, a younger child can't do it.
You say whatever I say. Lucy is on the box.
Lucy is on the box.
Lucy's being on the box pleases me.
Lucy's on the box pleases me.
That Linus is lying down pleases me.
That
Linus is lying down pleases me.
If I'm getting everything mixed up.
Okay. Very good, Dragon. The little boy can fly an airplane.
It appeared that small children could not copy everything they had heard, no matter how rewarding the experience.
And now the old lady says,
I am willing to admit that I cannot account for all the verbal behavior of a child, but I don't feel it's accounted for either by inventing some fictional explanation. I'm not suggesting that you do. I don't think you do. But I think the best thing is simply to say that there are still areas in which we're quite ignorant.
Noel is 18 months. He's just beginning to grasp.
What Skinner seemed to have missed was that humans are not simply blank slates.
which is the girl?
So what we can take away from Skinner's example is that there is a lot to learn from observation. You can reward or punish and see how people respond, and you can change behavior. But as the language example demonstrated, and what developmental psychologists will tell you now, is that parts of our brain have to be engaged, have to grow for children to acquire language. And there are other processes besides just simple reward and punishment that go into learning language. So sometimes what we observe is really helpful, but it may not be the full picture, and it might be that our research technologies are not advanced enough. We didn't have fMRI capabilities to measure the brain as effectively as we do now during Skinner's time, for example, or it might just be that there are some things that are really difficult to measure. And that's why, even though most of the research we're going to talk about does take this positivist view, and we do want to try really hard to observe and measure as much as we can to make unbiased, objective decisions based on data about how media are or are not affecting us, it's helpful to think about what are also called post-positivist views as well when we're looking at media and media effects research. So post-positivism is the idea that we construct our own worldview that perception is fallible. So there's not necessarily one objective truth like positivists argue. And that context and biases really matter. Even if we're trying really hard to be unbiased and just look at our data, our own worldview might influence how we measure the data, and then that can influence the conclusions we draw from the data. So there's not necessarily any one truth, even though we strive to come to as communal or as objective as an understanding as possible. So what's the truth about media effects? Well, we're going to use systematic observations of how people use and respond to media, and we're going to use a variety of methods to collect that data to make those observations. And hopefully by using a variety of methods from a variety of researchers, we can come to a general understanding of the ways in which we gain knowledge about media and its effects on us as people. So that's a little overview of social science and media effects. Thanks.